From Seoul, South Korea, you're listening to Asia News Weekly. Surviving a typhoon, Xi's effect on Korea and Japan, and comfort women sue Korea. These stories and more are on the July 11th edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to Asia News Weekly. I'm your host, Steve Miller. Tuesday, Okinawa was hit by Typhoon Neoguri. The storm brought powerful winds in excess of 200 kilometers per hour as it made its way across the island and onto Japan's mainland. Over 500,000 people throughout the prefecture were ordered to evacuate, and after the initial brunt of the storm, up to 95,000 experienced power failures. Any storm of this magnitude warrants caution and respect. At least 19 casualties have been reported thus far, but if you were to believe the media warnings leading up to Neoguri's landfall, one might have the impression this storm was of apocalyptic nature. Hidetaka Yusada said, "I wouldn't call this the strongest typhoon we've experienced, but it's moving slowly, and we're feeling it for a very long time." Concerns over flooding and landslides remained as the storm proceeded to the Japanese mainland. Catherine Spoor, a popular travel writer and YouTube video blogger who chronicled the events in real time, joins me from Okinawa. Well, good morning, Catherine. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I am fantastic. Thank you very much for asking. Now, before we get into the discussion about the typhoon, I do want to make sure that you and your family are, of course, safe.
Yes, we are absolutely fine.
Excellent. So I have to ask a question. Going back to before the typhoon hit the other day, what did you make out about all the warnings that the government issued?
Well, one thing about Japan is that they are really on top of making sure everyone knows what is going on and sending out as many warnings so that people can be aware of what's happening as possible. So it was a little nerve-wracking, but it's pretty much what we expect from a storm like this.
Now, was there any kind of difference between the warnings issued for Neoguri versus any of the others that you've experienced?
Actually, yes. We had a lot more heavy rain and landslide warnings, and there were a lot more evacuation notices or suggestions from the government than I've seen in the last 10 years.
Okay, so one thing that I really got the impression as someone who was on the outside looking in was that in the wake of Typhoon Haiyan, a lot of individuals were expecting this to be a really catastrophic storm. They were calling it the storm of the decade. And they were expecting to have the same kind of devastation that we saw in the Philippines in Japan. Was that an impression that you got from all the media attention?
Definitely not. One thing that is very different between the Philippines and Japan is the infrastructure. Here, especially where I am in Okinawa, we have a lot of concrete buildings. We have specialized drainage so that the storm surge that does come in can drain much easier than it would potentially in a place like the Philippines. So although people, I think, were really concerned about the same type of results that happened in the Philippines here in Japan, that's just not the type of thing that would happen here.
Now, the other thing that we saw in the aftermath of the typhoon is that there wasn't a lot of structural damage and casualties were pretty light. Do you think that now that we're halfway through the typhoon season, that people may say, okay, this was the storm of the decade, and we weathered it pretty easily? Do you think this could possibly lull people into a false sense of security as the season progresses?
I think for some people here in the southern islands of Japan, we have a lot of foreigners that do live here. I think for them, maybe it might feel like we don't need to prepare as much for future storms. However, for the locals, and I always speak to people about this and emphasize this, it is always important to prepare for all of the storms that we get, regardless if they are huge storms of the decade or if they're just a little thing blowing through. And I think that people in Okinawa, people in Japan, they're going to continue to prepare accordingly for the future storms.
What's been the most difficult thing about this storm in particular?
To be completely honest with you, I think it has been the rainfall that came with the storm. The winds themselves were not so bad, actually, for my area. It's including the southern Japanese islands. Although they were strong, like you said, they didn't cause as much damage as some people might have expected. But actually, as the storm moved away, we got something like 14 inches to 19 inches of rain in one day, which caused a lot of flooding. So the worst part was actually as the storm moved away, as opposed to when the storm was right on top of us.
Thanks, Catherine, for joining me today. If you would like to take a look at some of her videos, be sure to visit asiannewsweekly.net for the show notes, where there's a link to her YouTube channel. In just a few moments, the effects of Chinese President Xi Jinping's trip to South Korea. What's happened this week since the meeting that both snubbed North Korea and Japan? Wednesday, about 190 million Indonesians went to the ballot box, roughly a third of which went for the very first time, in order to elect a new president, in what many are calling one of the tightest political races in history. Their choices come from opposite sides of the political spectrum. One is former Army General Prabowo Subianto. He's the former son-in-law of ex-dictator Suharto, and he has various claims of past human rights violations against him. The second choice is Jakarta Governor Joko Widodo, affectionately referred to as Jokowi, and thought to be a man of the people. Jokowi had a strong lead in the polls, but Prabowo surged in recent weeks, making this election too close to call. With only 8% of the population undecided, the presidency was up for grabs. Some Chinese Indonesian residents said that they received text messages pressuring them to vote for one particular candidate. In Indonesia, voting takes place between 7 a.m. and 1 p.m., and then quick counts are released in the afternoon. The quick counts have served as fairly good predictors with about a 0.5% margin of error in the past. Official results of the election will not be known for nearly 2 weeks. As of Wednesday afternoon, Jakarta-based Saiful Mujani Research and Consulting showed that the Joko Widodo ticket had 52.8% of the vote against Prabowo's only 47.2%. The margin of error for that quick count was only 0.68%. In a victory speech, Widodo said, "This is the victory of the entire Indonesian people." Prabowo responded later by saying, "It's not over. We should respect the KPU, the General Elections Commission. The battle is not over. We should ensure that the KPU is not influenced by circulating quick counts that are misleading." Quote, "While the quick counts are usually reliable, there remains the possibility of vote manipulation over the next 2 weeks before the official result is announced," says Concord security analyst Keith Lovard. Jakarta resident Brian Long shared his thoughts.
7 quick counts if Jokowi wins. 7 credible survey agencies. They do usually quick counts for elections. And behind Prabowo's are conglomerate. They sit on the government already right now. They belong to the old regime. They are strong, very strong in money, of course. Some of them owns TV stations like RCTI, Global TV, MNC TV, okzone.com. It's a news website, TV One. On the TV that I stated, they always say Prabowo wins, and they always show their own quick count version, but from non-credible survey agency. We can actually Google them, the survey agency. And right now, mostly on social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, people bullying them for doing this fake info about quick count.
To get more information on this story or any of those mentioned in this week's podcast, visit asiannewsweekly.net. While there, I hope you'll take the time to share your thoughts in the comments, or you can do that via Facebook or Twitter. Just go to facebook.com/Asian News Weekly or follow at Asian News Weekly on Twitter. Last week, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited South Korea. It was a trip that could potentially shift alliances in the region. It caused North Korea to go on a missile launching spree, and now U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel have traveled to Beijing to meet with their respective Chinese counterparts. Over the course of 2 days in Korea, Xi was treated like a rock star, with countless Chinese living in Seoul clamoring hand over foot to get a glimpse of the leader. The meetings he had with South Korean President Park Geun-hey also changed up the status quo. First, China and South Korea announced they would directly trade currencies. A renminbi clearinghouse is planned for Seoul to boost yuan trading. Chinese tourists are flocking to Korea, so this move makes sense. It's also seen as a step towards internationalizing the currency. Direct yuan to won trading will mitigate exchange rate risks and help bilateral trade grow in a more stable and predictable way, said Tu Xingquan of the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. With business out of the way, it was time for Xi to turn his attention towards Japan, which had just recently reinterpreted Article 9 of its constitution to allow for collective self-defense. In his speech, Xi said China and South Korea experienced enormous suffering and called Japan's expansionism barbaric. This came a day after he suggested a joint celebration of Japan's defeat this coming August. When Xi returned home, his rhetoric against Japan continued, speaking of, quote, the intractability of history, as China commemorated the Second Sino-Japanese War. In China, it's referred to as the War of Resistance against Japan aggression. Quote, history is history, and facts are facts. Nobody can change history and facts, she said. Anyone who intends to deny, distort, or beautify the history of aggression will never be tolerated by Chinese people and people of all other countries. It's a pity that a small minority of people still ignore ironclad history and the fact that tens of millions of innocent people lost their lives in war. The purpose of Xi's visit to Korea was clear. Distance China from the DPRK and play up the joint victimization by Japan to Korea in order to woo Park away from the U.S.-Japan alliance. It was a tactic that didn't go unnoticed. Quote, any attempt by China and South Korea to coordinate in picking apart past history is unnecessarily and making it an international issue is utterly unhelpful for building peace and cooperation in the region, said Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga. North Korea responded to the visit by unleashing a massive onslaught of armament into the Yellow Sea in mock amphibious landing drills, meant to intimidate South Korea and demonstrate an independent ability to wage war. Kim Jong-un also continued his missile launching spree, bringing the total so far fired in 2014 to 90. I'm not sure if Xi honestly believes he can drive a wedge deep enough between the United States and Japan for Park or subsequent Korean leaders to break ties, but we are seeing a very calculated game being played by China, not only on the peninsula, but in the surrounding waters. Do you think Xi's so-called charm offensive will have anything more than economic benefits? And what do you think will be China's future relationship with the DPRK after this? I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments and keep the discussion going. Later, South Korean comfort women sue their own government. If you're interested in Asia, be sure to check out our other podcast, Asia Now. It features stories, conversations, and news taking place in Asia now. This week, Scott Ackerman, he's an American living in Japan, spoke about his concerns regarding Japan enabling collective self-defense.
It's really a strange situation. I'm kind of the guy who is always on the fence with everything political. I don't want to call myself a conservative or a liberal, even with my own political values. And same thing goes with this. I'm kind of on the fence. There's an aspect of it that affects me greatly due to the fact that my kids are Japanese citizens, even though they are what you call quote unquote hafu, which means half American, half whatever. It can really be anything. And if there was a call to arms or there was some sort of draft instated in the future, which at this point, I highly imagine would never happen. But you never know. You never know. I would have to suddenly take my kids back to America.
I also introduced 3 Asian foods that, well, many people find a little bit disgusting.
At roasting, you expose them to like 350 degrees to 400 degrees Fahrenheit of heat. So I guess if there is any iota of bacteria on it, that would die in the roasting process.
Well, it's something I'd heard about and wanted to try. So we were doing a kind of multi-country trip, and we're in Hanoi. And I didn't think it was going to work for our schedule. And my wife, Becky, was not very thrilled with the idea, but we had some time come up free. So the house that we were staying at, I got talking to the guy that owned it, and he introduced me to a cab driver. And the cab driver was really excited. So he drove us out, I think it's called Lamont, which is kind of within Hanoi. And you kind of go back through a pretty sketchy-looking area, and you kind of pulled up to a gap in the fence.
And while I wouldn't call the fried tarantula absolutely delicious, I would say that's very analogous to a piece of bacon. You see, those that prepared this tarantula actually did barbecue it, and there was a hint of barbecue flavor on the tarantula. So as I bit into the legs, they instantaneously snapped off. They were crunchy. There was no hair to get in my teeth because they had all been seared off by the barbecue. If these clips have piqued your interest, you can listen to these episodes of Asia Now in their entirety on our website or download them through iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn. Asia Now comes your way every single Monday and Wednesday at 12:01 p.m., and that's Seoul, Tokyo time, which is GMT +9. Even as ISIS increases its efforts in Iraq and tensions mount in the China Sea, the 21st century has brought with it another type of warfare in the digital frontier. In East Asia, 2 nations have proven incredibly resourceful at hacking overseas servers. China has made several U.S. businesses its target, while the DPRK actively targets South Korea. South Korea is often thought of as being on the cutting edge of technology, but in the past few years, North Korea has successfully completed several debilitating attacks against Seoul, crippling financial, broadcast, and government websites. Quote, North Korea appears to have some 5,900 personnel for cyber warfare, up from around 3,000 2 years ago, said an unnamed military source. That source continued, the communist country operates a hacking unit under its General Bureau of Reconnaissance, which is home to some 1,200 professional hackers, and it's believed these units operate in locations abroad, like China. That South Korea has been affected so many times by cyber attacks is nothing short of embarrassing. Over the years, I've commented that one of the reasons I feel South Korea is especially susceptible to these attacks has been an over-reliance on Windows XP and ActiveX. These are 2 outdated technologies that are riddled with security flaws. Earlier this year, South Korea began a plan of replacing all computers with Windows XP with Windows 7. However, that operating system may be phased out by Microsoft in 2020. The government doesn't want to be held hostage to an outsider again and has announced a plan to develop its own operating system, much like China announced previously. The hope that is by funneling development internally, the project will help give a boost to technology firms in Korea. The process has worked in the past, which has led OnLab and Hancom to dominate the virus software and word processing sectors. On the surface, and from a local business perspective, it seems like a good move. You get the product you want, and you help out local companies. However, with OnLab installed on most Korean computers, it hasn't stopped the proliferation of malware and viruses to run rampant in the country. In fact, it's not uncommon to walk into a computer lab running the virus protection software, insert your USB, and then walk away with a virus or 2. It just isn't as effective as stalwarts McAfee and Norton. When it comes to word processing, Hancom's Hangul software presents an entirely new set of problems. While it's useful in Korea and can read other types of documents, no other word processors can interpret its proprietary document format. Hancom's software isn't any better than Microsoft Office, but because the government threw its weight behind it, Koreans have generally followed suit. This is where the future of cybersecurity could potentially be a problem for South Korea. Reliance on OnLab hasn't been effective in preventing breaches, and if the developed operating system is as unique as Hansoft's Hangul, it could actually open up Korea to more attacks because there would be fewer resources to safeguard the systems. Korea has a 20-year history of cutting corners to get things done. It led to shoddy workmanship when the government rebuilt its national treasure, Namdaemun Gate, and was responsible for the Sewol sinking. It's naive to believe that something similar wouldn't occur with this project, potentially crippling the nation. What is the future of software development? Should countries take the Chinese and Korean approach and develop software in-house, or is open source the answer? Since Korea is one of the largest economies in Asia, is it wise to create a homegrown OS when staring down the barrel of a cyber warrior giant like North Korea? Please share your tech-oriented responses in the comments. This last June 25th, 122 South Korean comfort women filed suit in Seoul Central District Court. When stories of this nature usually surface, the topic involves the forced recruitment of women in Asia to serve in Japan's military brothels throughout the first half of the 20th century. However, this is not the case. The plaintiffs in the suit claim they were forced to provide sexual services to U.S. military personnel in government-designated special areas around U.S. military bases dating back to 1957. The women claim their activities were controlled by the Korean government and have asked for $10,000 US, a formal investigation, release of the findings, and an official apology. It's something that's not talked about by the South Korean government, and the women involved, they say they weren't coerced into prostitution. However, they do cite the hypocritical nature of Seoul as it continues to seek further reparations for the comfort women during Japan's reign, and conveniently overlook their past. Our government was one big pimp for the U.S. military, said Kim A-ran. They urged us to sell as much as possible to the GIs, praising us as dollar-earning patriots. The women and academics say the program grew out of fear GIs on leave would abandon Korea and go to Tokyo. So the government wanted to create a way to keep them, and more importantly, their money on the peninsula. To this end, the women say the government offered English and etiquette classes to help them seal the deal. Quote, if the question is, was there active government complicity, support for such camptown prostitution? Yes, by both the Korean governments and the U.S. military, said Catherine Moon, author of Sex Among Allies. The allegations are not surprising, given that in 2014, the U.S. military is still struggling with the problem despite efforts to reduce and eliminate human trafficking near its military bases. The women say few Koreans know of the practice that took place up until the 1980s, when Filipinas slowly phased out the Koreans as prostitutes in so-called juicy bars. Kim Ki-jue said in 2006, although we did not actively urge them to engage in prostitution, we, especially those from county offices, did often tell them it was not something bad for the country either. A parliamentary transcript from 1960 recorded Deputy Home Minister Lee Sung-woo mentioning that the government had made some improvements in the supply of prostitutes and the recreational systems for American troops, despite prostitution being illegal. One person from Japan pointed out, South Korean and U.S. double standards are awesome. You call Korean comfort women for U.S. military as prostitutes. On the other hand, you call Korean comfort women in World War II as sex slaves, said online commenter Nadasiko Love. However, as previously noted, the defining difference between these two groups of women is that those under Japanese rule were forcibly recruited. Now that does not mitigate the deplorable nature of human trafficking. It also doesn't absolve Japan for taking responsibility for its actions just because Korea did it too. As Koreans continue to call upon Japan to look objectively back at the past and stop whitewashing history, so must Korea review its own path to the present and take appropriate action. It's often said the Korean courts aren't the most objective, and many believe the Sewol ferry crew will be unable to receive a fair trial given the charged nature of the case. It leads one to wonder if the women bringing this suit forward will also have the evidence reviewed through uncolored lenses. What's your opinion on the issue? Is it a matter of the pot calling the kettle black for Korea? Will the women get a fair hearing in the courts? And has Korea matured enough to admit any wrongdoing? Leave your comments here or share them on Facebook and Twitter. Well, my friends, those are all the stories for this week's podcast. As usual, you left some phenomenal, some insightful, some incredible comments on last week's show, so let's take a look at a few of your thoughts right now. First up is Darth JF. I think China has been overplaying their hand with Hong Kong and Taiwan, with the end result of ending up alienating large segments of the population in both Hong Kong and Taiwan. China needs to realize that they can't just buy people's loyalty through economic prosperity. They also need to create a society that people feel is just and that they don't mind being a part of. Bevan wrote about a divided South Korea. It always amazes me to hear people suggest that a divided Korea actually benefits South Korea economically. Certainly, unification would result in massive disruption throughout the region. However, taking into consideration the expense of maintaining such a massive army, not to mention the unquantifiable sociological toll of living under constant threat, and the burdens being forced on all the young conscripts, it seems unfathomable that unification could be more costly, at least in the long run. I wouldn't be surprised if the current Chile-Korean-Japan relations might not improve without so many guns in the room, and the division between the major powers in the region has allowed China to throw its weight around, and in a way that isn't to very many people's real benefit. The status quo is definitely benefiting some minority right now, but the expense to the entire region is astounding and has ramifications that extend far beyond. And finally, one last comment from Critique Cat, who left this comment on our Asia Now interview with Scott Ackerman speaking about Japan's collective self-defense. It's clear to anyone who knows Japan and has studied the regional history, and in particular, Japan's history, why they are building up its military. It's for one single purpose, and that is to confront the rise of China. Allowing these lunatics in power to have the power to invade other countries is like giving the nuclear bomb to Iran. The current government of Japan consists of insane fundamentalists, revisionists who believe Japan did nothing wrong during World War II. Those people cannot be allowed to have the power to invade other countries. I want to thank everyone for leaving their comments. I really do appreciate them, especially since you do have to take the time to write them out. I also hope you'll continue to do that this week with the topics that I chose to discuss. And also, you guys listening to this podcast each and every week really mean the world to me. I really do appreciate it, and it's amazing to see how this podcast has grown. So if you know of someone who's interested in Asia, interested in Asian news, I hope you'll take the opportunity to introduce them to this podcast. If you have any feedback about the show, what you like, what you don't, shoot me an email. You can reach me at podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Well, that's it for this week's episode. For Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller, and until next time, remember to be true to yourself and always be awesome. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.